Maybe we can start now. So a very good afternoon and good evening to all of you joining this important consultation. As you know, we will be talking about the recent IPCC report, which came on August 9th. IPCC report AR6, Working Group 1 report on the physical science basis. And also its probable influence on the COP26, which is going to start in less than 25 days. So I welcome all of you on behalf of the organizers. This consultation is being organized by 3 organizations based in India: Center for Community Economics and Development Consultant Society, CTCN, Public Advocacy Initiatives for Rights and Values in India, and Movement for Advancing Understanding on Sustainability and Mutuality, which in Hindi we call it MOSAM, which is colloquial of climate. I was muted accidentally, sorry for that. So I welcome all of you in this consultation. And the organizers are a group which have been trying to intervene and contribute to national climate and sustainability conversations. We have been trying to input dimensions of justice and looking at proposed solutions from the lens of, say, power relations, equity, and justice, not only nationally, but also at regional level and at international level in COPs. We work on different multilateral and international spaces on climate, SDGs, and environment. And my name is Ajay K Jha. I work with PAIRVI and CTCN, and I am co-chair of the Major Groups and Other Stakeholders Coordination Committee on the HLPF, which is the main institution to look into the monitoring and implementation of the SDGs. I also am elected regional facilitator for UNEP for the Asia Pacific region. I welcome all of you. We are joined by a very eminent panel of speakers, and I have the pleasure, I feel great pleasure in introducing them. Our first speaker is Prof Krishna AchutaRao. He is from IIT Delhi, and he's one of the lead authors of the AR6 IPCC report, and also contributing author of the summary for policymakers for the Working Group 1 report. So I welcome you, Professor Krishna, to this meeting. Our second speaker will be Soumya Dutta, who we fondly call Soumya Da. He has been associated with us for a long time, and he has been associated with several movements like Bharat Jan Vigyan Jatha, and he has been in the advisory board of the Climate Technology Center and Network. And we are very happy to have you, Dada, here. We are also joined by Meenakshi Raman. Meenakshi needs no introduction. Meenakshi is from Third World Network, and we have been educated on climate negotiations by the splendid reportage of Third World Network on climate negotiations. And she has been looking into and contributing to international negotiations in the various spaces and conversations that we have in COP and also other various forums. Our last speaker will be Tetet. Tetet has been a good friend, and Tetet currently works with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung based in Philippines, but she has been associated over a period of, I think, more than 2 decades with various regional and global civil society networks, including Asia Pacific Research Center and also IBON International. She has contributed significantly to Committee on CSO's Partnership on Development Effectiveness also. So very warm welcome to you, Tetet also. So without any further blabbering, I will now give the floor to Professor Krishna AchutaRao. Before we go ahead, just house announcement that we are having this meeting in restricted meeting mode, and some of you might find your capacity to unmute yourself disabled, but be sure that we will everybody will be allowed to unmute him or her when we go into the discussion format in between the conversations and also towards the end of the conversation. So I again welcome all of you on behalf of the organizers. And now, Professor Krishna, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ajay Jha, and it's a pleasure to be here. My role is well defined. I am going to present to you a brief summary of what the AR6 report contains. And let me share my screen. I believe I need permission to share my screen.
Just a moment. Rajneesh, can you please make Professor Krishna co-host so that he can share his presentation? Yeah, you can do it now, Professor Krishna.
Okay, I hope my screen is visible now. And
yes, okay. Very well, Professor Krishna, please go ahead.
Thank you. Briefly, I'm going to touch upon the major highlights of the AR6 report and leave the headline messages for you, as it were. One of the first headline messages from the report is that recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years. This comes from looking at measurements of temperature across the globe, and also from reconstructions using various paleoproxy information. So if you look at the last 2000 years, the global average surface temperature has stayed more or less flat for all but the last 150 years plus. You can see how this warming is unprecedented in any period within not just the last 2000 years, but it appears to be at least in 100,000 years. This increase has been ascribed to human activity, and this figure on the right shows climate model simulations which include human activity and which exclude human activity, plotted along with the observed changes. In the teal greenish color, you see what would have happened if only natural and factors were included in a climate model simulation. But the moment you include human activity into the climate model simulations, you see that you are able to match what has been observed. And this observed warming is primarily from emissions of greenhouse gases. So if you look at what the observed warming in perhaps the last decade relative to later part of the 19th century is, we have about a 1.1 degrees Celsius increase. Now, this increase is almost all due to human influence. And if you just look at what the greenhouse gases have contributed to, the warming is actually more than what we experience. And this is because we also emit other pollution, such as aerosols that we can see and breathe and suffer from. And these aerosols have an effect of cooling. So without this cooling, from aerosols, we would actually have reached 1.5 degrees Celsius earlier. But in a combined influence, that's what we are observing at 1.1 degrees. None of the other factors, whether they are natural factors or what we call natural variability, has any effect in this increase over the long term. It's unequivocal that human influence has warmed not just the global mean temperature at the surface, but the entire atmosphere, the oceans, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, which is all the ice-covered regions, and biosphere have occurred. This increase in temperature has been something that many previous IPCC reports have covered. But what's unique about the sixth assessment report has been the amount of attention that has been devoted to extreme weather and climate. And one such extreme is hot extremes, where temperatures have been rising. And these are not just the gradual increase in temperatures, but events, heat waves, etc. And these heat extreme events are any part of the world that you might think of. You see that there is a brown color indicating an increase in hot extremes. So this is a figure, stylized figure indicating different parts of different continents. So you may make out what's North America, South America, Africa, Asia, and Europe, and Oceania here. So you can see that hardly 2 or 3 places in the world where we are uncertain because of limited data or because there's low agreement. Every other place on Earth has shown an increase in heat extremes. When you come to extreme rainfall, heavy precipitation, for example, all the regions marked in green show a significant increase where human influence has been found. There remain more regions of the world where we are not 100% sure about the increase in heavy precipitation events, but that's a question of time where we have sufficient data and sufficient studies before these regions are also implicated in increases of human-caused changes in extreme precipitation. So these lead us to conclude that it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts more frequent and severe. I haven't shown you a picture of the increasing droughts, but the IPCC report contains one such figure. Climate change is already affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways. We've already seen in the extreme heat and rainfall events. But in addition to these, there are multiple other changes that are documented in the report. And the report also documents how these changes we experience already will increase with further warming. When we look at the further warming, what our future might provide in terms of either changes or surprises or unintended consequences, there are 5 scenarios that the IPCC report examines. And these 5 scenarios are what are called shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. There's an SSP1, which is a sustainability pathway, SSP2, which is called the middle of the road, SSP3, which is more regional rivalry-based pathway, SSP4, where inequality is high, and SSP5, which is a really high-end emission scenario because it is fueled by fossil fuels. So these different scenarios provide us ways in which we can look at what future actions are likely to lead us to. So one of the key messages from the fifth assessment report that has been confirmed in this report is that the amount of warming at any point of time is proportional to the cumulative amount of CO2 emitted up to that point in time. So this figure here shows cumulative emissions. This is not a time axis. This is as you emit more and more, what happens to the temperature, and you can see that there is a near linear relationship. So if we look at where we are, this is given in this black line up to this point. You see that we've already used an emissions of up a little more than 2,500 gigatons of CO2, which has led us to a warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius. But if we look at this figure, we can also read off in some sense what the remaining parts of our budget are if we have to stick to the ambitious Paris goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius change. Or so because of this relationship, one can actually look at what the remaining carbon budget is in our goals of restricting climate change to under 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C. So this blue bar on the left indicates what we've already emitted up to 2019. And if we have to keep warming under 1.5 Celsius with some degree of confidence, then the carbon budget that's available to us is shown in this orange color. Depending on how certain you need to be, your budget changes. If you want to be more certain than 67%, which gives us 400 gigatons, then one has a smaller remaining carbon budget. If we look at the 2 degree target, then there's slightly more of a remaining carbon budget. But given that we are emitting at the rate of about close to 40 gigatons of CO2 per year, even the 400 gigaton budget is likely to be exhausted in 10 years unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. If we don't do that, that 1.5 degrees C target will be beyond reach. This is partly because as we emit more and more CO2, the ability of what our natural sinks are, whether in terms of the land uptake of carbon through vegetation or the oceanic uptake of carbon, both of those are going to be overwhelmed, and most of our budget is going to, or most of our emissions are going to go into the atmosphere. So our sinks will no longer be as helpful as we keep emitting larger and larger amounts. And this implies that as we go to greater levels of warming, and this is what happens if we are at 1.5 degrees, you can see the patterns of change. These are just amplified patterns of what changes have already occurred in our observed change. And at 2 degrees, 4 degrees, these regional changes are going to be further amplified. But you can see that there is a clear increase in temperature across the entire globe. In terms of rainfall, though, things are not as straightforward because rainfall is not as uniformly changing as temperature. You can see here at 1.5 degrees Celsius, there are some regions of the world where you do see increases in precipitation, and these are represented as percentage changes. Any place which is green indicates regions that might be experiencing more rainfall or precipitation of some kind. So the brown colored regions will experience drier climates. And you can see how both the wet and the dry regions are going to become wetter and drier in warming climates. So this situation where you can have some regions getting more than current levels of precipitation and some regions getting much less than what they currently receive is going to be quite problematic. And this also plays out in terms of extreme heat and rainfall events that are projected for the future. If you look at heat extremes, hot temperatures over land, you can see that what events would have happened once in 10 years in, let's say, the late 19th century already occurs 3 times more frequently. So it occurs about 3 times in a 10-year period. And as you increase temperatures, these increases are much, much more. In a 4-degree warmer world, it would be an every year occurring phenomenon. So, but that's not all. If it was a 1 in 50-year event, something that happened once in 50 years in this late 19th century, it now occurs 5 times in 50 years, or it is now 1 in 10 years. And as you go to warmer and warmer times, these extremes become much, much more common. So the message is that some extremes that are already more or less common will become more common, but the rare events that we used to get will become much, much more common, as we've all recently witnessed. And this picture doesn't change. It's the same whether you consider heavy precipitation events over land. So these are already 1.5 times or so more frequent than they used to be. Droughts, again, are a 10-year, 1 in 10-year event is now likely to be once every 2.5 years or so. So we have lots of bad prospects for extreme weather and climate events, and these are agricultural, ecological droughts, heavy precipitation, heat waves, and these are things that are prominently going to be affecting us in the future. There are many other changes that I have not had time to discuss. There's no going back from some of these changes, such as melting glaciers and ice sheets or rising sea level. But these can be slowed, and perhaps some can even be stopped by limiting further warming. To limit global warming, strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases are necessary. This would not only reduce the consequences of climate change, but perhaps also improve air quality. Thank you. I will stop here and hand it back to Mr. Ajay.
Thank you so much, Professor Krishna. We understand that this report brings much more scientific attribution of human activities, anthropogenic activities to climate change, but it definitely brings a message of more poverty, more hunger, and more diseases among people who are on the front lines. So thank you for giving us the highlights of the AR6 Working Group 1 report. Now I will invite Soumya for his reflection on the report. And Soumya is, as I said earlier, is a people scientist, and he has given us scientific insights from these reports in a very user-friendly manner that we generalists could understand. So, Soumya, the floor is yours. I hope you will speak both on the science and the politics of the report. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And good afternoon or good morning if in other countries people are listening or joining in. And how much time do I have?
Dada, you can take 15 minutes. Just a moment, for people who have joined us late, and welcome to all of you. जो लोग हिंदी में सुनना चाहते हैं वो नीचे के टैब में इंटरप्रिटेशन वाले बटन को दबाएं तो उसमें हिंदी का ऑप्शन आएगा और हिंदी क्लिक करेंगे आप तो हिंदी में सुन सकते हैं. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dada.
Okay, thanks again. Good afternoon and namaste. We are talking about both the IPCC AR6, the Working Group 1 report, as well as what will be the global stage of action, the COP26. Of course, we all understand that the COP26, those 2 weeks are not the only one where the negotiations are going on, will be going on. Negotiations have been going on in countries, between countries, within countries, their positions. So one good thing about this IPCC report is that, as we all are saying repeatedly, there is nothing completely new, but the attribution is clearer. That's one. Second, it also re-emphasizes that we are really at a precipice. We are at the edge of an abyss. So if we do not take drastic action, which we have been talking about for quite some time, these 30 years of negotiations have not done much. In fact, just before this, few months or maybe a year before this, the UN Secretary General had to say we are sleepwalking into a disaster. So that do not seem to have changed much. Even after the IPCC special reports, the 1.5 report, the cryosphere report, the land report, the scenario has not changed much in the global arena. If you look at after the Paris Agreement, except 2020, 2016, 17, 18, 19, every year emissions increase. Just the CO2 from 36.5 to around 37.4 gigaton. So we are actually globally, and again in 21, once the global lockdowns etc. ended, so the emissions have started again. In fact, it will be rising probably more than 7% from 2020 baseline. So even though it was agreed in Paris that it will be best effort will be made to keep the limit the warming below 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees, not 2 degrees. Nothing seems to be happening towards that side. In that sense, again, this report is welcome. This report of physical science basis is welcome. Of course, one very clear problem of most of these reports, of course, the physical science report is not supposed to do that, but neither the Paris Agreement nor the generally the official reports generally talk about actual ground level actions by government, by business and industry that needs to be done. In fact, we all know that roughly around 100 companies, 100 corporations, they emit more than well over 70% of the emission. So all these individual actions actually are a smokescreen. The governments, if they want, they can do it. Controlling 100 or 200 corporations is far easier, would have been far easier if there was a political will. So that's one thing which makes people a little skeptical about whether anything really needed, urgently needed, will be done after this report. But anyway, there's another problem with IPCC reports that we have been pointing out continuously, that IPCC, of course, this is not to blame the scientists working in IPCC, because as we all know, the IPCC is not purely a scientific organization, it's an intergovernmental panel. So what comes out of the IPCC as a final report has to go to the vetting process of the governments. So as some of the contributing authors earlier came out in the open, that something like in one particular area, 38 graphs have to be removed. We don't know what has happened actually. But that's what the contributing authors from different sections are also reporting outside, the frustrated authors. So that's one problem, that what is the latest finding of the science. IPCC probably is not completely free to come out with that. That's misleading in a sense when you are facing an emergency, you are facing a crisis. The other problem with the IPCC report is reports throughout, even in 2013, they are 5.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you please speak a bit slowly?
Okay,
So
for the translation, fine. So even for the other reports, even the 5th report, AR5, it was the same thing. If you look at the IPCC report's predictions and what happened on the ground actually, throughout this reports period, the actual climate change has exceeded, in most areas, has exceeded what IPCC has predicted. And this has very serious consequences. If you see, even the 2019 special report on cryosphere, etc., if you remember what it said about the Arctic region, it says the warming in the Arctic region is happening more than twice as fast. The recent 2021 report, and that was in 19, the 2021 the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program that came out, that it is the Arctic region has warmed almost 3 times as fast. And the problem in connected issues, connected problems with these reports are, of course, again, what I'm saying is, when the IPCC comes out with the report, this is on published peer-reviewed papers. These are published years back. So whatever is coming out very recently will not be in the cognizance. Maybe this will be in the next report. So that will be quite late by going by the time scale that climate change is increasing. But the other problem is IPCC has been, as I said, is not only conservative. The other major issue is, do we clearly know, as do IPCC take into account all the possible, I think Prof Krishna AchutaRao will be able to answer this later on, but what we have been hearing, that many of the feedback mechanisms, the positive feedbacks, that probably are not accounted for fully, because the models earlier were not equipped. Present day models might be equipped, but whether everything is being taken into account, that we need as civil society, as global citizens, we need to really understand, because we are standing at the edge of an abyss. If you look at the SSP projections, SSP2, which is 4.5 to 4.5, if you look at mid-century, mid-term, 2041 to 2060, it goes into the best estimate is 2 degrees, very likely range is to 1.6 to 2.5. We really don't know if the average temperature rises beyond 1.5, whether the Arctic methane release from the Arctic Sea, shallow oceans like the Laptev Sea, where the methane release has increased to 400 times as per some reports. I don't know whether this is right or not, but it has drastically increased. So whether these are actually being triggered beyond the tipping point by going beyond 1.5 or going beyond 2, because many of the top climate scientists are also saying you will only know when you have crossed the tipping point, when the tipping point is crossed. Just before that, we can probably predict that this is very, very close. Can we take that kind of risk? So what I find in lacking in IPCC report, though of late it is becoming, the sense of alarm is becoming more and more pronounced. This sense of that this is irreversible, we are entering a phase of runaway climate change. We are entering a phase when there will be the point of no return. So that probably that sense of urgency is really not coming out, and particularly in question with the feedback and the tipping points. So this is one very clear thing. Like, as I said, if the Arctic has already warmed by 3.1 degrees Celsius, then is it enough to trigger both the permafrost methane release, the methane nodule release? So these figures, we know this has increased tremendously, but whether we are very close or whether are already crossed, we don't know. So that science needs to be focused on. The other points that we need to understand as not only civil society, as citizen who need to respond, who need to adapt, because some of the things, like we all now know, 1.5 degree target probably is no longer feasible. this in the rear view mirror of our so-called quote unquote progress, the car of progress, the bulldozer of progress. So that's probably no longer possible. But is it possible that if we cross 1.5 degree in the decade of 2030s, all the Earth systems, because the Earth system science is showing most of the Earth systems are connected. So will all the Earth system will still be able to come back at the stage where 1.5 degrees Celsius is not there, or it is less? We don't know. So those kind of sciences needs to be strengthened. And also this projection that you can go up to 2.4 or 2.5, and then probably you can get back. I think this is too optimistic, because earlier science, even a few years ago, what showed there are differences between climate scientists on this, but many of these scientists are saying that if you go up to 2, there will be point of no return. That's what a lot of science has been done on this. Of course, science is always improving. The accuracy is always improving. Probably we'll be able to, but we'll all be very happy. But these are points where a very small neglect or a very small mistake, intentional or unintentional, can cause global catastrophe. We can cross the point of no return very soon. So these kind of things we'll expect IPCC to raise the alarm, level of alarm, because at this point of time, there's nothing to lose. There's everything to gain by becoming more alarmist. Of course, we understand the negotiations are completely political. These are not scientific, these are political. So whatever is acceptable to the political leaders will be coming out and will be acted upon. But at this point, at least as a quote unquote scientific body, an intergovernmental scientific panel, IPCC has a responsibility to sound the alarm strong and loud. So that though, as I'm saying, IPCC's reports are becoming more and more critical, sounding the critical point, but these kind of issues that, okay, we can still go ahead with SSP2, SSP3, we should have had a clear position that SSP2 and SSP3, those are pathways. These are really not pathways that the world can go and come back from. So where is that comeback point of no return? Where are the tipping points? Have we already entered? Like recent report, again, there must be uncertainties. The recent report that the Amazon rainforest might have or might be becoming a net carbon emitter. So if that happens, it will not be only for the Amazon rainforest. It will be for most of the tropical rainforest, because the temperature rise and the excessive release of the bacterial activity, increased bacterial activity. So methanogenic bacteria also, not only carbon dioxide, but methanogenic bacteria also in the wetlands. So are we really projecting that we can go up to 2.6 or 2.7 and come back and the world can be, we can again come back to a comfort zone? We are probably forgetting that need to grip these alarms. Like I was noticing the time when I was born, the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration was around 316, 17. This year, the average will be already, it's past 416. And average will be probably 417 or something. So within the period of my lifetime, it has increased 100, which has not happened for close to 2 million years probably. So with that kind of quote unquote human progress, development, are we in a pathway that we can still be talking about net zero? I'll stop after going through this. IPCC and every UN agency is still gung-ho about the net zero targets with emission reduction technology, the CCS and CCA, carbon capture, then carbon sequestration and storage, carbon sequestration and use, all these kind of things. None of these have been proven in any scale. The second thing is, if all the countries, they are committing to net zero, that means they will still be emitting in 2050, not 2030. And then what is the country? What is the system that will be sequestering all this carbon? Everyone will be emitting positive, net zero. So where that plus emission, positive emission will be sequestered, we don't know. So I think IPCC as a scientific body, whatever is the intergovernmental intervention, should also come out when the mitigation adaptation reports come. I think we will hope, but we have not seen that happen in the IPCC. IPCC toes the line of net zero, even in this net zero throughout this. So I think that net zero first need to be pointed out, because it's throughout the world. If you see, there is a little strong focus on renewable energy, basically electricity, not even energy, renewable electricity. We forget electricity is not more than 20-22% of the global energy basket. So rest of the things, rest of the economy, steel, aluminum, cement, petrochemicals, paper, everything, those are not just electricity. Those are other energies where very little transition has taken place as of now. A lot of technologies are being developed, very little transition has taken place. And that cannot happen. As we have seen historically, a full transition takes place at least 55 to 95 years, which can happen for solar and wind electricity because these are last century technologies. Many of the possible or needed technologies will not be coming in time. So as I'll end by saying this, the COP has a tremendous responsibility of going beyond what the IPCC is saying. It's very unlikely to go. The IPCC had a responsibility as scientific bodies, as the people who are the first to understand what kind of crisis and emergency the earth is standing in front. They have a responsibility. They have really not done that kind of, they have not really fulfilled that responsibility of going out of the way and sounding the alarm. Still a little conservative. I think it's high time that we come out. Of course, I'm not, again, ending by saying I'm not blaming the IPCC scientists. They have done a very good job, commendable job. But it's up to us now. If IPCC is not coming out with the kind of alarm, it's up to us to really unpack this and say there is much that is hidden inside the IPCC report, what they have not come out with. And don't go by this. We can go up to 2.5, 2.7, 2.8 and come back. We will not be. So it's best, whatever action needed to be taken, we don't go up to even 2. And what are those kind of actions? Let's take from the IPCC and other reports and pressurize the governments if we have the capabilities. If we don't, we'll commit the future citizenship, not for today, because this hothouse earth theory and others are showing that the earth has multiple stable states. And once we push it beyond the current stable state, the other hotter state, that will also be a stable state. I am not sharing my slides, etc., not needed. But that state might be stable for thousands of years. That means next 50 to 60 to 100 generations will be committing to an earth which we have probably will not be habitable enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dada. I think you have brought very comprehensively people's concerns on the science of the IPCC, and Professor Krishna will try to answer that. Before I go back to Professor Krishna, I also see colleagues from MGFC colleagues from UNEP and also colleagues from Asia Pacific Regional CSO's engagement mechanism to welcome to all of you. I also acknowledge presence of Justice Panachand Jain and Vijay Pratap, who are trustees of MOSM, one of the organizers of this consultation. And I also acknowledge presence of Sarojini Rengam, Director of PAN Asia Pacific, who is also regional facilitator of Europe and Asia Pacific. So welcome to all of you. If you have any questions, you can put the question in the chat box or raise your hand so that we can allow you to unmute and ask your question on the science of the IPCC report or any question related to the presentation of Professor Krishna AchutaRao or Mr. Soumya Dutta. I have also one question that a lot of civil society organizations keep asking, and I hope Professor Krishna AchutaRao is paying attention to all the questions that Soumya raised, and also this one, that negative emission technologies earlier was supposed to just mop up a small amount of left emissions. But with this concept of net zero, I think they have become center stage, giving countries the flexibility to continue to emit and try to mop it up later in, say, planetary scale. And is that possible? How do you address that question? Yeah, thank you, Professor Krishna Rao. Please go ahead. Rajneesh, can you unmute him, please?
Thank you. There were quite a few questions, and let me try and address these to the best of my abilities. First, I would like to take up the issues of where the report might have lacunae that were pointed out by Soumya Dutta. I think the general impression everybody has is that we are conservative, and to an extent there is some truth in that. Our conservatism comes from the requirement that we have these set deadlines before which, if there's any literature, we are free to assess. Things that come after those deadlines, we are not allowed to cite. This is as per IPCC process. So, we all have our issues with the process, including the scientists who are part of it. So, but be that as it may, we are bound by that until there are changes to that. So anything that happens to come after January 1st, 2021 is not part of the report. So that is one limitation, and that's a structural limitation. In terms of the other points that were raised, whether there are these tipping points, whether are these methane hydrates or other irreversibilities in the system, I think this report actually delves into it. It's not in all the headline statements, but if you go into the report, there are sections where we deal with something called deep uncertainty. So this is where the scientific community is very divided, and methane hydrates and the sudden overwhelming release of methane hydrates from the Arctic region, there's a tremendous amount of disagreement in the scientific community. There's also other uncertainties in how, for example, the ice sheets on Antarctica or Greenland might suddenly collapse. So these are what the report refers to as deep uncertainties, where there's fundamental lack of knowledge or lack of clarity. So there are discussions of that and what might happen, for example, in the worst case scenario with the ice sheet collapse. So there is a section in the report that I encourage those of you who might be interested to take a look at this deep uncertainty concept. It goes beyond our measures of uncertainty, where we have quantifiable numbers of what is certain, virtually certain, etc. So that is one part of it. So there are some figures, for example, that will show you if it were true that this happens in the extreme case, what is the likely outcome. So then the question of net zero. So I think this report actually says you have to zero out emissions. Net zero is something that is actually an economics construct. It's not a scientific construct, and as was rightly pointed out, we do not have proof of concept that this will work. So until that point, this is just economics, right? What you could potentially do. But given that this is a concept which seems to have some legs, what we in the report have done is actually examined what happens if you suddenly stop emitting and start removing CO2, right? Somehow, some magic technology happens and you're able to remove it at a planetary scale and take carbon dioxide out of the air. So there is actually a section that tells you that the climate will not go back to what it was. You cannot, it's not like a volume knob on your radio that you can just dial it back down. It doesn't work like that. There are many systems that do not go back along the same path that they increased. And that is also a section for those of you who might be interested in looking at it. It is in the chapter 4 of the full report. So some of these, by virtue of just the volume of the report, do not make it into the headline statements, but they are there. So the interested reader can certainly look at that. So I don't know if I've missed any other questions, but I think I've hit upon net zero and whether you can dial it back down. So clearly the thing about the different scenarios is that this the different SSPs are constructed as a kind of a collaborative effort between people who model social systems as well as climate systems. So inherently there are inadequacies in these scenarios. I think we need to understand that these scenarios are hypothetical. They're not designed that you should follow them. It is a question of what if we did something. So these are not necessarily the only options. Perhaps there is a better pathway, but again, those are political questions. In order to merge the political questions of what if, what would happen if we emitted all fossil fuel, or if we were conservative and if we did that, there are different climate outcomes that are there in terms of the physical climate. But for a physical climate scientist, in order to be able to model that, those outcomes are in terms of emissions that are prescribed, without which our models, they can't make up. And as of yet, we don't have the capability of in real time applying different policies at various times and seeing what happens. So we have these unfortunate limitation of seeing how it plays out over a long period of time. Now, I think there was one more question buried in terms of these long-term, what would happen if the climate goes into another stable state. Now, clearly, the report does not go into what happens beyond a 4 degrees Celsius. We know that there are some feedbacks that are short or fast feedbacks, as they say. Not all feedbacks take many centuries. Some feedbacks are happening on weekly, yearly timescales. But in terms of the slow feedbacks, these, for example, with the carbon cycle, etc., could take hundreds of years. And these feedbacks exist in the models, but without being able to observe and make sure that we are getting them right in the models, it's impossible to say whether we have it all correctly. Because, as you might imagine, it's easy to predict for the next few days what could happen, or the next few years when in anybody's lifetime, much easier than to be able to project multiple generations down the line. So that those uncertainties are existing in the climate science, and those are well acknowledged. The feedbacks, to the extent that we know are correct, are usually the ones that are faster feedbacks. The slow feedbacks that take multiple centuries, they come with a larger uncertainty, and therefore it is hard to be certain what will happen 200 years from now if we carried on and on and on without actually growing a brain and seeing that what we've done is already much worse than what should be. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Krishna. We understand that science is certain, but still there are too many uncertainties to be able to predict this very reliably in a very short period of time. Thank you for giving us insights and educating us on the main message from the report. Now I will go to Meena. And before I hand over the floor to Meena, I'll like to foreground this with our expectations. One is that we are definitely fighting a climate crisis, but we are also fighting post-politics. And we have seen that increasingly decision-making powers and processes are being taken out of the realm of the democratic and public decision-making from the intergovernmental platforms and being handed over to multi-stakeholder governance. This is not entirely new, I would say, but we have seen the worst of our fears coming true in the recently organized UN Food System Summit. So do you think that we can fight climate crisis and this post-politics at the same time, and what we expect in terms of COP26 outcomes on these? So over to you, Meena.
Thank you, Ajay, and good evening. In case some of you think that I'm from India, I'm not. I'm from Penang, Malaysia, although my mother and father have roots in India. So yes, welcome. I do have a set of slides, Ajay. Perhaps you can share. I didn't expect you to ask me the question about the what happened at the FAO. Of course, everything is about politics and power, as Soumya has also said. But basically, I think that we have no other alternative but to keep fighting, whether at the international level or at every fora, and even with our own governments sometime because of all the agendas. So taking the implications of the IPCC report to the COP, what exactly is going to change? I think that's really a very important question. Will there actually be a response of a kind that is needed? But most of us are very, very skeptical about it. But let's see what the main issues are and the concerns are. Can I have the next slide, please? For developing countries, I think the other thing that we need to also bear in mind is that at the time that the IPCC report has just been released on the physical science, we are also facing unprecedented challenges in terms of the COVID pandemic. Many of our countries are still not out of the woods. There's vaccine apartheid. There's a lot of inequity in terms of even the vaccine distribution, huge fights going on in the WTO, even in terms of making the pharmaceuticals available or the pandemic response to be far more, not stifled by intellectual property and the TRIPS agreement and so on, such huge challenges. But what we need to understand at this particular stage is that given where we are, according to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, many developing countries are no longer able to achieve their ambition set out in Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement due to the pandemic. And this is absolutely frightening. And delivering on those ambitions will require international cooperation between the North and the South on a coordinated and unprecedented scale across the series of deeply interconnected economic, social, and environmental challenges, with estimates of the required additional investments amounting to a minimum of 2% of global GDP annually, which is upwards of $1.7 trillion per year for the next few decades. Next slide, please. So is this really possible? Now, in the COP26, are we going to see multilateral cooperation of a kind that we have not seen before? But let's look at the history. History has taught us that you cannot rely on the developed world because they keep shifting the goalposts and and do not keep promises that they have already committed to. For instance, the 100 billion goal per year by 2020. Developed countries in Copenhagen in 2009 and in Cancun in 2010, they agreed to mobilize the US 100 billion per year by 2020. This figure was not based on any assessment of the needs of developing countries. It was rather a figure plucked up by the then Secretary of State of the US, Hillary Clinton. And so till today, the developed world has failed to meet this promise. And in 2015, in Paris, the goalpost to meet this target was extended to 2025. Next slide, please. So the US 100 billion, if you look at the claims by the OECD, they claim that 78.9 billion in 2018, and now they say about 80 billion in 2019 has already been mobilized. And what they say is 70% of this goes to mitigation, 22% of this, or 21% of this goes to adaptation, and the remaining is cross-cutting. And the share of loans in total public finance provided, 52% to 74% for the years 2013 to 2018. And this is largely loans. And the share of grants decreased from 27% to 20% between 2013 to 2018. And the private climate finance mobilized by developed countries during 2016 and 2018 focused almost only on climate mitigation. So this is coming from the OECD report. Next slide, please. Oxfam analyzed the OECD report, and their climate finance shadow report actually shows that the climate-specific net assistance in 2017 to 2018 was only 19 to 22.5 billion. Reported public climate finance for adaptation was 25% and mitigation was 66%. And the grants, 20% were loans and the other non-grant instruments were 18%. So you see that grants was very, very minuscule. And climate finance to small island developing states between 2016 and 2018, 15% was that in loans. And so climate finance to the LDCs, 66% of it was in the form of loans. So already in a pandemic situation where you have rising indebtedness, the climate finance figures also show you that much of this is going in the form of loans, which will further exacerbate the indebtedness of countries that actually need the money. Next, please. Next slide, please. If you look at the Multilateral Development Bank Finance Report, total climate finance in 2020 was $66 billion US, out of which 40% went to Europe or the European Union. Can you believe that? That from the MDBs, a lot of it goes to Europe and European Union. And mitigation finance, again, dominated with 76%, and 76% of total climate finance was committed through investment loans. And the largest share of the mitigation finance went to the EU of 48%, and 64% of the total adaptation finance was committed through investment loans again. So everything is about largely loans. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest issues for COP26 and even before, but this has really come to a big fight now. A key issue is for developing countries, such as the like-minded developing countries of which India is in, has been on the need to have an operational definition of what climate finance is. This lack of an agreed operational definition for climate finance has resulted in uneven reporting and variable data being provided by developed countries on their climate finance contributions under the UNFCCC. So what the developed countries do, they can count anything, even if it's development finance, repackage it as climate finance. And so they continue to really not, escalate or enhance or claim of beating the finance when actually it is not so. Next, please. So the needs, look at what the developing countries' needs are. The needs expressed in the nationally determined contributions. This is what the Paris Agreement, commitments that parties have made. Developing countries have expressed $5.7 to $5.8 trillion, which is needed by 2030. This is in their Paris pledges. In terms of adaptation needs, the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report already shows that 140 billion to 300 billion is needed by 2030, and 280 billion and 500 billion by 2050. And adaptation funding channeled through the UNFCCC multilateral climate funds was only 1.25 billion per year for the period 2017 to 2018. And if you look at the Global Commission on Adaptation, US 1.8 trillion from 2020 to 2030 was available. So what you see here is that the needs far outweigh what's available at the moment. Next slide, please. So where are we? In the GEF is the Global Environment Facility, in the 7th replenishment process, they actually pledged, the developed countries pledged 40% less than the previous replenishment. So instead of going up, it went down. For the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, initial resource mobilization, 10.3 billion was pledged. 2 billion of that was under the Obama administration, which did not come through because of the Trump administration. And in the first replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, 9.66 billion was pledged. And I will give you an update about the Green Climate Fund shortly. And so on that 100 billion per year commitment, we are far from the target. So really far. Next, please. So in the GCF, I think we can skip this slide. Basically, the Green Climate Fund is balanced treatment between adaptation and mitigation, but it's not happening. It's the operating entity of the convention, UNFCCC's mechanism, and also for the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. The GCF resources which have been committed, we understand that the board meeting that just took place recently, the total commitment is now 10 billion. The number of projects which have been approved is 190, of which mitigation again is 68%, and 32% was for adaptation. And what was really sad to note was that the executive director of the Green Climate Fund in Milan just a few weeks ago said that the current, if the current meeting, which has already taken place, has approved the 1.2 billion for 13 new climate projects, what the fund would have used up all their resources before COP26. So this is absolutely frightening in terms of the money that is, how it comes in terms of small drips and drabs. And the next disbursement schedule from developed countries is only in mid-September. So as we go into COP26, even the GCF is running out of money. Next slide, please. So the question really is money available? So what is lacking is therefore really, as far as we understand it, is political will, because it is available. And so President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela in 2009 in Copenhagen said that the United States can produce dollars, just print them, and they think they've saved the banks and the capitalist system. And if the climate was a bank, they would have already have saved it. And that is true. If it was the bank, it would have been saved. But climate finance is not the bank. So the climate finance needs are not insurmountable, because if you look at some of the recent reports, according to a McKinsey study, developed countries are able to deploy $10 trillion in just the first 2 months in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is 3 times more than the response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Next slide, please. So where there is a will, there is a way, quite clearly. And in response to the COVID pandemic again, the Western European countries alone have allocated close to $4 trillion, an amount that is almost 30 times larger than today's value of the Marshall Plan. As you all know, the global Marshall Plan after the World War, massive coming together of the world. And yet, we have this unfair world at this point in time where what is most needed is international cooperation of an unprecedented kind. And if you look at the G7 governments and what they provide in terms of support for fossil fuel subsidies, 87.7 billion a year. And this is according to a recent estimate by a IISD report based on a 2017 to 2019 average. And France, the UK, and Canada provide the most among their peers in terms of fossil fuel subsidies, a huge amount of subsidies. The G7 has said recently that they will end fossil fuel subsidies. And so this money hopefully will be available for the developing countries, but we will have to wait and see. Next, please. And in the most recent announcement of the IMF, the special drawing rights, so one of the most accessible and low cost resources of liquidity is special drawing rights, a reserve currency that can be exchanged for cash. And it's created by the IMF in 1969 to support member countries for foreign exchange reserves. And SDRs are based on a basket of 5 currencies, which include the US dollar, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, and the Japanese yen, and the British pound. And unlike other IMF instruments, the SDRs are non-conditional, non-debt creating, and so it is a useful liquidity tool, not similar to quantitative easing that was done in the United States. On the 2nd of August this year, the IMF approved a general allocation of SDRs equivalent to $650 billion, about 456 billion in terms of SDRs, to boost global liquidity. And it is supposed to be the largest SDR allocation in the history of the IMF and a shot in the arm for the global economy at a time of unprecedented crisis. However, as pointed out by the UN Secretary General at the opening of the UNCTAD 15 conference, this support largely goes to countries that need them the least, as they are distributed according to the quotas. Antonio Guterres has called for a substantial reallocation of unused SDRs, not a symbolic one, a substantial reallocation to vulnerable countries that need them, including middle-income countries. And just to note that countries receive the SDRs according to their quotas or financial contributions. And this creates an inequity by which almost 60% of SDRs go to wealthy countries, and those who need it the most receive it the least. So such SDRs can also be used for tackling climate change. Next slide, please. Next slide. So for us, COP26 must be about real ambition on finance because of the massive scale of the transformation needed in terms of decarbonizing our economies and also in terms of increasing our forests and sinks and so on. COP26 needs to deliver the real ambition on finance, not just promises by developed countries, but a clear roadmap on delivering their continued existing obligations to mobilize the 100 billion per year from 2021 to 2025, with emphasis on grant and non-debt creating finance, and mainly from public resources. And there is a new collective goal that they must agree to before 2025. And this new collective goal on finance must be enabled by a process with a detailed roadmap by developed countries, including the outlining of milestones for setting a goal prior to 2025 based on the real needs of developing countries. And that will not happen unless we have massive demands and demonstrations and protests, particularly in the North, and particularly by the young people who are out on the streets shouting at their governments. Next slide, please. And finally, just other issues of concern. We talked about net zero earlier, both Soumya and also the first speaker. I think what we need to realize is that this is really not just economics, but it's politics. It's the developed world, including the UK presidency for COP, and also the UN Secretary General, whom I think is not been advised properly, where this whole claim about net zero has come about. So climate justice groups have shown that the net zero targets by 2050, especially for developed countries, are against equity and fair shares. in the distribution of the remaining carbon budget of the 500 gigatons of CO2 for limiting temperature, the 1.5 limit temperature limit. Now, this ignores cumulative emissions and historical emissions on a per capita basis, and this is a ploy to delay actions by developed countries. So instead of having real zero now, or even going to negative emissions now, developed countries are saying that we will do, whether it's the US with a 2050 net zero by 2050, UK net zero by 2050, Japan, and so on. And so this is ridiculous, pushing distant targets, which actually are a ploy to delay action on their part. So the budget will be, the remaining carbon budget has no space for them, as Soumya has already said. So how do they do this? They do this through carbon markets and nature-based solutions. And this is a big deal in COP26. The Article 6, as they call it, many of you must have heard it. So there's a big push to launch massive carbon markets so that developed countries can continue to do carbon offsets. We have no space for carbon offsets anymore. Offsets merely mean that you emit 1 ton of carbon and you offset it, you continue to emit while you plant a tree to sequester it. It doesn't work, as our first speaker had already said. It's very flawed science. It's not even science, it's bunkum. So what you have here is that they're talking about developing countries having massive amount of money coming to them in nature-based solutions. You know, what is this? So this we say is actually amounting to what we call carbon colonialism. And we are very concerned about the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. It also raises issues of land and forest conflicts. And there is not enough nature to accommodate all these offsets, as Soumya has said. So these are really false solutions and dangerous distractions from the real decarbonization and reforestation that must happen. And on the issue of nationally determined contributions, one of the issues is really whether parties should have 5-year timeframes or 10-year timeframes. And it's really not such a big deal for this group for all of you. But what's critical is that it's not about the time frame, but it's about the content of the ambition that matters. And how do you enable that, particularly for developing countries, to have the means to implement that? Can you stop the slide so I can just end and conclude? So what we see here is actually a massive deception that is being brought, and COP26 is going to be heralded as far as if the British have their way. They have saved the planet because of net zero emissions and because of the launch of international carbon markets. And that, for us, would be a massive tragedy. And we have to stop that at all accounts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meena. Your presentation and message is very clear. While all the global south is looking up to GCF, they have empty coffers. And you also talked about nature-based solutions. We are having huge fight in the UNEP space to prevent this concept from becoming a norm. And we believe it's largely self-labeled. You can label anything as nature-based solutions. We don't have any clear definition. We don't have principles, etc. So thank you for highlighting all of that. Now, before I go to Tetet, I'll request participants and colleagues, if you have any question, put your question in the chat box or raise your hand so we can allow you to unmute after Tetet speaks. Tetet, as we talk a lot about climate crisis and miseries of the people, we also celebrate resilience of the people and struggles of the people's movement. And I know people's movements have been asking very profound questions of how the solutions COP and industrialized countries are proposing changes our exploitative relation with nature. How does it addresses the issues of power relations, justice, and equity? And I know that you have been engaging with a lot of people's movement and civil society organizations going to COP and also otherwise. So sorry for holding you up to this time, but I think we have saved the best for the last. Floor is yours, Tetet. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ajay. But I'm really very honored and humbled to be in this panel. No, all the big wigs are in this panel tonight, and I only hope I can also, make a little bit of contribution So in terms of the topic, I think for many social movements, the IPCC assessment report is an affirmation of the gravity, the urgency, and the scale of the climate crisis. Could it be improved? Definitely, as Soumya has already mentioned, but it cannot be denied anymore that this is an emergency. We are in a crisis mode. Yeah, science has given us a very strong evidence for declaring a state of planetary emergency to unleash world action that accelerates the path towards a world that can continue evolving on a stable planet. Now, COP26 is one of the last chances for the world leaders to commit to the transformations needed to tackle the climate crisis. We've heard it already, more than 3 decades of intergovernmental negotiations. Where has that brought us? It has brought us deeper into the climate crisis. But we have to realize that decisions made in Glasgow will shape how governments respond and decide the fate of billions. Who is going to be sacrificed? Who will escape? And much worse, who will make a profit? Yeah, because it's all about profit making. So as social movements, as civil society, we have tried to call for the postponement of this COP because of the much larger issue of vaccine inequity. Now, the British government would say that it aims for to be the most inclusive COP ever, but we know that it's like going through, one hurdle after the other. And with the UK government also changing its plans one day after the other. Yeah. So what is clear to us is that what will make this a really inclusive COP is that of the UK government and other rich countries agreeing to waive the trade-related intellectual property rights on vaccines and other life-saving medicines and medical equipment, so that people can really be safe in their own communities and also be safe asserting the voices for climate justice. But that is not what we're seeing. They would rather donate, as rich countries, they can always buy their way out of any messy situation. The UK, for instance, would rather pay off quarantine costs. Now they're saying only 6 countries remain in the red list. So Philippines, India, we've been taken off from the red list. It should make us happy, but no, it should make us really, really scared, because the safety, requirement for having the COP is already being breached. And with 40,000 cases each day in the UK right now, it's bound to be, a super spreader event. But of course, the British are always so arrogant, no? So it's being said that COP26 should herald ambitious climate action, rallying the international community behind. But then again, we challenge this. Inaction is seen as the biggest stumbling block. But no, there's been a lot of climate action in the past. Only it's not moving in the right direction towards achieving those solutions to the fundamental problems, to the root problems of the climate crisis. Now, increased action from everyone to solve the global problem, that is already trying to do away and demolish the very foundation with which the UNFCCC was founded on, that of common but differentiated responsibility, without addressing the structural and systemic roots of the climate crisis. This climate ambition could be a very dangerous distraction, and it's proving to be as such. Now, climate action now is being used as a smokescreen for more climate disruptive, carbon intensive programs that reproduce the same inequalities that were pre-existing and exacerbated by the pandemic. We've heard so much from Meena and Soumya already about, countries now riding the bandwagon of net zero emissions through nature-based solutions. Net zero means, the atmosphere is spared new emissions by restoring forests or using technologies that capture carbon to balance out. Basically, it allows rich countries and corporations to buy and dazzle their way out using techno fixes instead of transforming their production and distribution to achieve real zero emissions. Nature-based solutions through public-private partnerships, no? Nature restoration and conservation. This is basically a recipe for more land and resource grabs, driving communities that are reliant on forest, subsistence farming, away from their primary source of livelihood and away from the very, giver of life, the forest, where they have been stewards for many generations now. So there's something really perverse, no, when we hear government leaders say climate action is needed, but what they give us are carbon markets, negotiating, more potential avenues for corporations to profit from the climate crisis. It's very unfortunate that we're even discussing the role of carbon markets in climate action. That is so perverse. No, but unfortunately, that's where negotiations have brought us. And at COP26, dang, we are going to try our very best to ensure that, those loopholes are plugged. Human rights safeguards, it's a very low bar. I'm very disappointed, but that's the most that we can do at the moment. No, we should block this deal. No deal is better than a bad deal. Now, Meena's already elaborated on climate finance. I will not go there, but I would rather stress loss and damage, because this is something that the IPCC report has affirmed also, the intensity, the gravity of, extreme weather events will really cause massive losses and damages to lives, properties, even the non-economic aspect of it. Way of life, culture, language, traditions. You cannot put a price tag on all of those things. But because this crucial issue of loss and damage has been relegated, downplayed in technical discussions, instead of being a very political discussion at the highest levels of the COP, we see that the Warsaw International Mechanism, after 5 years, 6 years, it hasn't really done much in terms of actually providing support for losses and damages due to climate-related impacts. So we're hoping that at this COP, civil society through social movements can raise and elevate the profile of loss and damage as supported by the IPCC 6th assessment report. So what we need to do now is to really hold governments and corporations accountable for the climate crisis. We know that a healthy environment will always be at odds with neoliberalism. Now, it's not just about dodging responsibility for emissions, but desperately they're trying to make over and green capitalism. Now, any discussion around climate positive recovery would have to be in the context of finding alternatives to capitalism. And that is where, we should be hammering the governments and these international institutions about economic democracy, gender justice, social justice, redistribution. Now, so again, I would like to stress, inaction is not the problem. It is actions that maintain inequality and injustice that heightens, exacerbates climate crisis. So let's all go to COP, but even if we cannot, let's mobilize at capitals in our countries. No, we should really raise the alarms because we are in an emergency crisis mode. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tetet. Thank you so much also for your energy that we receive always from you. Now the floor is open for any questions, remarks, or reflections. If anybody has. Anna Celestial is writing in the chat box. Anna, would you like to There is also one hand from Gangotri Chanda. Gangotri, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, sir, I have a question from Somerset's discussion. As we are facing extreme weather events and the disasters as well, which are more than the report indicates. Also, I have heard that this report by IPCC doesn't contain the actual data, rather to some extent negotiated data, which can make the people in power or the countries to sign it. Is this true?
Okay. Thanks for your question, Gangotri. We'll go back to Soumya ji on this question. Any other question or comment? Anna, would you like to ask your question or a reflection that you wrote in the chat box? Okay, I don't see any more questions. Anna has written, the same governments who commit to climate action are continuing to allow large-scale mining and logging operations, massive agro plantations that decimate forests, at times in the name of COVID recovery, and they attack forest and environment defenders and subject them to harassment, vilification, and other human rights violations. Thanks for your comment. We completely agree, Anna. Anybody else, any questions? If not, then we will go back to our speakers for their final comments. Maybe your message for the civil society organizations. More than 40 people are still continuing in this conversation. Your final message to them. So in this round, I'll go back in the reverse order. So Tetet, you first, and then Meena, and then Professor Krishna and Soumya. Yeah.
As I've mentioned earlier, COP26 is a make or break moment, and it will decide how governments and corporations will see who gets to live, who gets to thrive, and who gets to die. We should not allow that to happen. So from now until COP and even beyond COP, we should continue to, raise the bar and hold governments and corporations accountable, at the same time strengthening our movements. Because only the movements can bring about those real changes that will, contribute to a healthier environment and a future, the right to imagine a future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tetet. Meena, please go ahead.
Well, unfortunately, many of us are not going to Glasgow this time because of all the restrictions. So the TWN team, it's only one person from Geneva is going. The rest of us are all working from here. So it's really, so what you're going to be seeing is actually a lot of northern voices rather than southern civil society and movements. I think that is going to be a real problem. And so what we are doing is working with our COP26 alliances and groups in UK and particularly in Scotland. Many of us have been working together with them, and they're bringing the voices and the demands of social movements and civil society to those spaces. And I think one of the things that we need to worry about, and I think Ajay and others, wherever we can, because the English media will be there, all the biggest, the Guardian, the Financial Times, the whole media is going to be there, and the big message will be net zero and how UK saved the world and so on. So we really have to mobilize our journalists to understand so that they don't repeat the nonsense that comes from international media. So we really definitely need to be talking to journalists as well, and also to our own outlets in wherever we are. You don't have to go to Glasgow in order to mobilize action. So we have to do whatever we have to do in our countries and in our regions and amplify the voice. And this is not going to be the last COP. It's going to continue. So hopefully there are governments who will, I'm quite sure that a lot of them are already aware, particularly from the developing world, about the shifting goalposts and the inequity of the solutions which are coming through. For me, climate finance is absolutely key. And I think that would be a uniting force among all the developing countries. And I hope the G77 remains strong. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meena. This is a very important point that you have raised, and we generally try to keep our media people informed on what is actually going to happen. And a lot of us depend on TW and reporters to actually understand what is happening behind the scenes. So we'll try to do that this time also to the best of our capacity. Professor Krishna, your reflection or your last message.
Okay, I let me start by first clearing up one of the questions that was asked regarding the data about extreme events in the report. All of the data that is in the report is from published sources, and you can actually trace it back to where the data came from. In almost all cases, the data is actually available for anybody to trace back and download and use. So there is no negotiating the data. Of course, there is a wide disparity in which kinds of data is available from different countries. Even if it comes to weather data, our own country or my own country here is not very open with this. So these are issues that we have to face and deal with. But to take up another question that was posted in the chat box in Hindi, I will answer in English. Hopefully it will be translated accordingly. This IPCC report has caught the attention of many government people in our own country. I've had many conversations in the last 1 month. In fact, more conversations than I've had in the last 15 years that I've worked at IIT Delhi. And I think my parting message here is that, we climate scientists, at least in India, are not just ignored by the government, but we are also ignored by NGOs and civil society. Nobody talks to us. Nobody asks us because we are allies. We are working towards the same goal here of stopping climate change. So we need to be talking to each other more frequently. And I might also add that there are several scientists from the global north who are also our allies in spite of what their governments might do. And I can vouch for this personally, that there are many of us who are working together to move the science so that something like a loss and damage question actually has the scientific backing for somebody to be sued and taken to court in the next few years. So this is all science that is happening in the background. We don't normally get to talk to civil society people about such things, but I think there's reason for us to continue these conversations because it's very easy to get hijacked by politicians globally, and we need to work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Krishna, and very much appreciated. We will be definitely looking forward to scientific community and especially you in our further deliberations and also in our interactions with the communities on how the science can help them understand the impacts and prevent worst impacts of climate change. Thank you so much for being there. Now back to Soumya.
Am I audible?
Yes, Dada, please.
So my message is very simple, that we can guess what will be done by the governments and business and industry who play a lot of influence on the governments in the COP. Because we have seen we don't have to go back in history. We have seen recently the UK government, as Meena also pointed out, or Tetet pointed out, that they promised that this will be the most inclusive COP. It's going to be the most exclusive club or exclusive hist COP, because it will be excluding most number of people who should have participated. And the promises that were made that the vaccines, whoever delegate wants, the vaccines will be sent and people will be vaccinated. It has probably just not started. So we have seen promises earlier during this, after the Paris, around $5 trillion were invested in fossil fuels with the promise of tackling climate change. So we know basically what the governments and the business and industry are doing. Basically, we have created this crisis, now we'll profit by selling the package solutions. So that's the kind of approach. And that's why net zero and all the sequestration technologies, solar radiation management technologies, everything comes in. It's selling the solutions. It's not about saving people of the earth or life. It's about making profits by selling solutions for the crisis. So that way our task is very clear. Whether we are up to that is up to us. I'll again say, and let me not be misunderstood. I feel that within its constraints, within its limitations of being an intergovernmental panel, IPCC has done a very good job. That's there. Some scientists have gone beyond that. They are coming out in the open. That's extra. But within the limitations, IPCC has done a very good job. What people has not done in large numbers is, and that's a failure also of this message of criticality, of crisis getting communicated. Because most people under COVID was under tremendous stress just to survive. So the additional message probably is not going through. If we remember the kind of media hype that also was created after the SR 1.5 report, special report, it was almost similar, comparable. And then you know what happened in the 3 years hence, to this October 18 to October 21. So it's largely up to the people, up to the communication efforts, up to the understanding of activists, whether we are again happy to just do webinars and finish it in that, or whether we are willing to go down on the streets, stop things. It's not just telling people, I tell someone, he or she tells another. That's a small part, and that we have been doing for quite long. It's also essential now to stop those destructive things, which we have also been doing to fairly large extent, whether in India or any other country. But today it's urgent, because if we don't do it now, if we don't risk our personal safeties and go down on the street, if we are still in our offices and our little cubicles, we'll be failing the human population and the life of this particular climatic regime. Of course, there will be, even if a lot of life are extinguished or extinct, there will be a lot of other life which will be developing over millions of years. That's another matter. Earth has gone through this. But for our kind of lives, it's extremely critical. So it's time to go out of your comfort zone, to go far out, to forget about personal comforts and safety and conveniences now, and to stop the destructive things by positive action on the streets, in the media, in the public domain, and confronting. Without confronting the wrongdoers, without confronting the profit makers, you cannot stop this. So just stop being very goody-goody climate activists and all. You have to confront and stop. That's the message. Thank you.
Thank you, Soumya. Your message is very resounding and clear, and we also as civil society organizations will have to take a part of the blame that we have not been able to actually put the narrative which empowers local communities, and also civil society organizations. Many of them have been into offering depoliticized so-called solutions. So now the path is clear, but harder. And all of us need to engage to that to the best of our capacity. So thank you so much for your message. I think many of us will be definitely taking this message back from the consultation. And yeah, with this, we come to the conclusion of this consultation, and thanks to everybody who joined and continued with us in this conversation till this late in the evening. Thank you to all of you. You have been a wonderful audience, and thank you to all the speakers. We look forward to engage with you further very soon on a variety of issues and concerns and also challenges that faces us. So thank you, and
thank you from my side too.
Yeah. So good night to everybody.